All right, great. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is IPA's webinar, Do Graduation Programs Improve Outcomes for Young Children? So to quickly outline our agenda for today, we're going to start with an introduction just to provide some basic information about the webinar. And then we're going to include some background and motivation from two different perspectives. So the research that's being presented today is supported by two of IPA's sector programs, education and social protection. And so we're going to provide some of this background or framing for the research today and some of the work that we think would be useful moving forward from these two different perspectives. But the majority of the webinar is going to focus on our research presentation. So we're incredibly excited to feature three different research presentations. And so they will comprise the bulk of the webinar today, but we will leave some time for discussion at the end. So on that note, some broader information about the webinar. It will be recorded and added to IPA's website together with the slides. And we would like to encourage you to use the chat function throughout the webinar. So we think that this is going to be an opportunity for the webinar to be as engaging as possible. So we are really fortunate in that we are joined by the implementation partners who are associated with the research that's being presented today. So we have team members from AVSI, Yamba Malawi, and BRAC on the call. And so if you have questions about implementation or questions about the programs, they can potentially be engaged in the chat to be able to answer some of those. But then also more broadly, we have a lot of people attending today in the audience with relevant expertise and experience. And so we really encourage you to ask questions, provide comments, both about the research, but then also these broader topics. And so use the chat, which we will also be monitoring to identify questions for the discussion section. So then to just jump right in. So IPA has been building expertise in particular topics. This is represented by our sector programs. And as I mentioned, the research today is coming from two of our sector programs, so education and social protection. And so on that front, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Cave. I'm the Education Program Director, so part of our sector teams. And I am co-hosting today's webinar along with my colleague, Julie Kodrowski, who is the Director of the Social Protection Program. And so to introduce this topic and frame the research that's going to be presented today, we're going to be providing some background and motivation from these two different sectoral perspectives. So I'm going to start with education. And so we're really focused today on early childhood development. We have an extensive body of research and evidence showing how critically important children's first years of life are from a number of different perspectives. But one really important factor that we often consider is the development of the brain. That's really laying the foundation for future development with lifelong consequences. So we know that 80% of the brain is formed by the time a child is 3 years old. So that as part of broader development, we define early child development as this phase from prenatal through 8 years of age and covering the full range of development. And we just know how critically important this stage is in predicting all kinds of later life outcomes. And so there's a really wonderful growing body of basic research and other types of descriptive and other forms of research documenting how important this phase is. But we also have a really exciting, rigorous evaluation literature looking at the potential of interventions targeting children's early learning and development for improving all kinds of outcomes, both in the short term and long term. So we have really exciting foundation of cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness, showing how important investment is in this phase in children's early years of life. But one big outstanding question is this enough? Right? So we see positive impact, but is that really meaningfully transforming children's lives? Especially for children facing the most severe adversity, is this really going to change the trajectory? Is this going to realize the potential outcomes that we're most interested in? And one of the reasons why we're asking this question is because in addition to recognizing how important early childhood is and the experiences that children have in their first years of life, this is also where we start to see the beginnings of inequality. And so disparity, inequality manifests very early. So we have research showing that here I'm emphasizing a little bit of the education perspective, noting that, again, early childhood development incorporates all these different sectoral perspectives from health and nutrition. They're all very interrelated. But just emphasizing the education perspective a little bit, we start to see differences in children of high socioeconomic status and low socioeconomic status in skills such as vocabulary and language processing as early as 18 months. And then by the time children are 2 years old, some research finds a 6-month gap between children of high and low SES. So we really see the beginning of this disparity in very young children. And then by the time children enter kindergarten, SES gaps across a range of different school readiness skills are well established. And so this is why early childhood is critically important for the broader education field because of this foundation and because these gaps predict later educational and life outcomes. So if we aren't really able to intervene or address the beginnings of this inequity, then are we really able to realize the potential of early childhood, or do we need to think about, is direct intervention with children enough? We could think about having a great preschool program, but then if a child goes home to a household affected by violence, affected by food insecurity, extreme poverty, is that preschool intervention not going to be as effective as it could be? And is that child really going to be able to realize the type of outcomes and grow into their full potential? And so this kind of motivation also aligns with our broader understanding of caregivers and households and families being one of the most important influences on children's early learning and development. But if caregivers themselves are also faced by various challenges and the severe adversity we see affecting children, economic instability, extreme poverty, then are they limited in their ability to support children, also mitigate the effects of extreme stress and severe adversity? So again, knowing how important early childhood is, that's both the potential for supporting children's positive development, but then also in these challenging contexts, there can be threats to children's development that undermine and then again develop this predicting later inequality. And so could we think about early childhood development as targeting not just children, but then also supporting their caregivers and households and families? Is that one way that we could explore how to lead to more transformative or breakthrough outcomes that could really change the direction of a child's life? So this type of framing and thinking has been motivating IPA's Two Generation Initiative. So we're really excited that we have a portfolio of different projects supporting this question of how can we design, improve, and test different interventions, policies, programs that could improve outcomes for both children and their caregivers, taking more of a holistic family approach, recognizing that across different households, many different people can play a caregiving role. So looking at the types of outcomes that we can address around livelihoods, social protection, mental health and well-being, how can we support caregivers in addition to directly supporting early childhood development? And that could lead to all different types of synergies and maybe the type of breakthrough outcomes we're interested in for especially the households facing severe adversity. So with support from the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, this is what we've been doing as part of IPA's Two Generation Initiative. So we have a range of different activities as part of this work, everything from exploratory research, documenting some of the gaps that I was mentioning earlier between children of high and low SES, and new measures of early childhood development through stakeholder mapping and partnerships with international NGOs, local NGOs, refugee-led organizations, and policy partners. So we're really excited to be engaging with a number of different governments as part of this work, including, for example, right now we are partnering with the Ministry of Education and Sports in Uganda to conduct an initial baseline study for the country's new early childhood care and education policy. So really excited that this work is moving forward. And the research that I'll be presenting later today is the first RCT, the first evaluation that we have as part of this portfolio. So really excited this work is moving forward. And if you're interested, we have a new website. We really encourage follow-up and engagement for people interested in these topics and interested in learning more. But this provides just a little bit of the background and framing that we have coming from the education perspective and the early childhood development perspective around how our existing interventions are doing, and are they enough, or do we need to explore more transformative, interactive types of interventions or policies or programs? And one critical part of that is to think about how could we interact with efforts to reduce poverty, support households and livelihoods, caregiver well-being. And that's one of the reasons why connecting with the incredible work happening as part of the graduation program is a really exciting part of our work on Two Generation. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Julie to provide the social protection perspective.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. Happy to provide a few definitions. This is, of course, a webinar around graduations for those who are new to the space or new to the model. Happy to sort of explain it here. It's a multi-component, time-bound, holistic, and carefully sequenced set of interventions to help the poorest households on a pathway towards sustainable livelihoods and resilience. You'll see a graphic here of a more standard or traditional model. This was pioneered by BRAC in Bangladesh in 2002, and the model has evolved from an NGO-led innovation to a really powerful tool now being adapted and integrated into government social protection systems. The strength of the global evidence base around graduation has really accelerated the adoption and uptake. It's now present in 50 countries and serving more than 14 million people. Graduation improves household economic outcomes by design. It is a household level intervention. There are a lot of open questions sort of on the path to scale and the evolution of the model. One of which we'll discuss today is how those economic gains at the household level could be invested and how they might serve to mediate intergenerational transmission of poverty, as Sarah mentioned. The standard graduation model is not necessarily designed with child health and child development as a key focus, and generally doesn't measure those outcomes. And so this is why we have a bit of a thinner evidence base for these particular outcomes. It is one of the better sort of interventions to effectively help caregivers in this space, and we, as well as Sarah, sort of understand ECD as a critical and unique window through which this intervention may be able to serve the needs of children. There is little evidence that household poverty programs impact child development directly. There is some evidence, of course, from the cash transfer literature, and oftentimes that's more conditional cash transfers that are targeted directly at child outcomes. We do have a small body of graduation evidence that shows impacts on health, and there's some examples there on the right. So it's suggesting some opportunity in a space that's worthy of further exploration. Um, One methodological note is that most graduation studies, again, designed at the household level, not all have young children. And so many of these studies perhaps are not appropriately powered to detect impacts on young children. There are also cost and complexity considerations around child health and development measures, which we'll talk about with our researchers later on in the presentation. In terms of some examples, you're seeing some movement around underweight and wasting in Bangladesh, some overall health increases both at 18 months and 10 years, so some longer impacts in certain geographies, as well as some other impacts on young children. But these are some of the key questions around health integration. What program components within this complex model drive child nutrition gains, and how can they be further amplified through adaptation? And then what do we know about early childhood, focusing on caregivers as well as the most influential pieces in child development? And can the graduation model reach children in those critical early years? I think there are also bigger questions around how much is reasonable to expect from this program, how much can be integrated, and what's the value of perhaps parallel programming, linkages and referrals that are a little bit more robust in order to bolster outcomes for young children. Recognizing these gaps in the evidence base, we're privileged to partner with the Gates Foundation on what's called the New Way Graduation Research Fund, where we're exploring these priority research questions, including improving health outcomes for women and children, women's economic empowerment and agency, and then also looking at adapting the model for cost effectiveness and scale. We're currently funding 7 evaluations in 6 geographies. We'll focus on a couple of those today. In the next slide, you'll see a bit of a framework that sort of underlies this investment in our research in this space. It includes the women's economic empowerment and health outcomes pathways. These are 5 main pathways identified through existing literature through which a range of health impacts are plausible to be achieved through these interventions. We recognize these as sort of multi-directional, multifaceted, and mutually reinforcing, but there's limited causal evidence to better understand which of these pathways is most directly impacting health outcomes. So the studies in our fund look at least 2 of 5 of those pathways, and you'll see examples of that in the presentations today. There are 3 of those studies that focus particularly on health. You'll hear from the first 2 today in Uganda, in Malawi, and there's a third in Kenya that's just getting started that's focusing on nutrition-sensitive work. We'll go right into the presentations so we can hear from our research partners. We'll present 3 research studies exploring what happens with children in a standard graduation program, which is what Peter will be discussing, related to OPSI's program in Uganda, and then what becomes possible when child-focused components are intentionally integrated into the UPG model, which we'll hear from our partners in Malawi. So Peter Rockers is the assistant professor in the Department of Global Health at Boston University's School of Public Health. He'll present evidence on medium-term impacts of OPSI's model. Moritz Pohl is joining us, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Chicago's Development Innovation Lab, and Hans Husa is a PhD candidate in economics at Washington University in St. Louis, and they'll present results from Yamba Malawi's child-focused UPG model, which augments the standard program with ECD training. And then, of course, Sarah will be presenting findings from IPA's 2Gen initiative in partnership with BRAC, where they're combining BRAC's humanitarian play labs with ultra-poor graduation approaches in West Nile. So without further ado, I'm happy to hand it over to Peter. And thanks again to our implementing partners who are present in the webinar, and happy to receive questions as well. So as we hand it over to Peter as he gets settled with his slides, I just want to note that we've asked a lot of our researchers to present a lot of information in a very short amount of time. And so they will be focusing very succinctly on sort of what they've done and the results of that work. We'll sort of reserve the bigger questions around what this means for the space for the Q&A. But please, we encourage active conversation in the chat. And over to you, Peter.
Great. So can everyone see my slides? Oh, yes?
I cannot.
Okay.
They did, and then they were there and then they left. There they go.
Yes, now? Okay. Sorry about that. Great, excellent. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Sarah. So as Julie mentioned, I'm going to be pretty direct in running through what we did in this study and what we found, and then maybe if there's questions or discussion, look forward to digging into that a little bit more, maybe after the presentations. So this work is building on a randomized control trial that began in 2019 called Graduating to Resilience, conducted in Uganda. That study tested a few different variations on the graduation model, but the results I'm going to present here are really based on kind of a test of the standard model versus a pure control group. The PIs of that study also contributed to this work, one of whom, Doug Parkerson, is also on this call. And if there are questions in the chat, maybe Doug, you can help with answering some of them. So this G2R study has shown in over multiple waves now persistent positive effects on economic outcomes, consistent with, as was discussed, a very large literature showing that graduation works for economic outcomes. We did do in 2022 a relatively narrow test of impacts on child development in a sort of narrow age range, but found no effect, pretty precise null effect. So that's in this context. We've come back now in 2025, 6 years later, to test the medium-term effects of this program on a broader range of outcomes and a broader range age range, as you'll see. So just really quickly, methodologically, this is a cluster randomized control trial with village level assignment, a standard model, pure control village. We have children 0 to 9 years of age. For the most part, most of my presentations is going to rely on visualizations. We're going to look at a lot of heterogeneity in treatment effects across a few different variables. And we'll talk about that. But all the results I'm going to present are also robust to using more standard parametric methods. The measures I'm going to use anthropometry, so we're going to look at stunting in particular as a key outcome. But we're also going to look at some executive function measures to try to get a better understanding of neurodevelopment. And then we have a measure of school readiness, the IDELA, which folks might be familiar with. In terms of heterogeneity, I'm going to look at treatment effects across a few key variables. So look at wealth, try to understand whether the effects of the program actually are different depending on sort of the starting point of the household, the poorest versus less poor. We know that obviously graduation targets a segment of the population that's already by definition poor. But we're going to even look within that population across wealth as a starting point to try to get a better understanding of how the program works. We're going to look at timing. So as was mentioned, there's a rich literature obviously suggesting that the earlier investments are made, there's a critical window of opportunity, sometimes referred to as that first 1,000 days, the in utero period, the first few years of life. And we want to better understand how exposure to the positive effects of the program at the household level, how they might differ in terms of what they mean for children, depending on what age range the child is in when they're exposed. And lastly, we're going to look at heterogeneity across location. We're going to try to understand there's a literature, emerging literature, growing literature around how the environment, independent of the household environment, the village environment, the community environment, has an important role to play in determining human capital and child development. And we're going to have a look at that. So in terms of the average effects, we find basically a marginal, but still I think meaningful effect on stunting, about 5 percentage point reduction in stunting across the full population. Pretty clear positive effects on our measures of executive function, including a 0.2 percentage point positive effect on this measure of self-regulation, which is really a key outcome for predicting how children do in school, how they do later in life. And as I'll talk about, a measure that's particularly sensitive to stress. So a rich literature showing that self-regulation as an executive function skill is quite sensitive to stress related to poverty. I mean, I think that's part of the story of these results. And then positive consistent effects on the IDELA outcomes on the order of 0.08 to 0.1 standard deviation effect sizes. So in terms of what are some of the key pathways through which we expect these child development outcomes to be improved? I mean, obviously, lots of strong evidence showing graduation improves household level consumption. So in this particular study in Uganda, consistent with all of those previous studies, You see a increase in total consumption of around $30 PPP. A lot of that is an increase in food consumption. So these are treatment effects. That's on the order of about a 30 percentage point increase in these consumption measures. So quite meaningful increase in consumption in the households that got the program. Then in terms of what we see for the actual children, quite large, even this is 2025, 6 years later, quite large positive effects on milk consumption, dairy consumption, marginal effects on egg consumption. I mean, this is in an area where raw milk, in a rural area of Uganda where raw milk is probably the most available and cheapest source of nutrition for these children. So it's nice to see those positive effects transmit through these milk and dairy channels. But no change on anemia and no effect on these stimulation behaviors we measured in terms of asking. So the quantity of stimulation, the frequency of this type of caregiver-child interaction, we find no effect there. But we don't have a good measure of the quality of interaction, which I think I'll get to in a second as part of the story. We do see, consistent with a lot of literature on graduation, very big effects on adult women's reductions in psychological distress. And these measures of this is consistent with mental health measures. These measures are based on something called the Kessler-6, which is a measure of psychological distress, but on the order of 0.3 to 0.4 standard deviation reductions in these measures of distress, which is a important potential pathway through which children might benefit through this type of stress reduction in their caregivers. So let's look at heterogeneity. I think the results become clearer when we dig into. So now on these figures show on the x-axis baseline wealth of the household. And what you're really seeing here is that the treatment of the positive effect on stunting, the stunting reduction, is very much concentrated in the poorest households. There's almost a threshold here below around $12,000 PPP, where the positive effect on stunting really starts to show up in that poorest segment of the population. On the other hand, what we see in the right-hand figure here is that same population that seems to have the positive effect on stunting, you see the opposite in terms of self-regulation, where there's a null effect as you get to the poor end of this distribution. And the positive effect on this executive function scale, and this is consistent with the other executive function measures, is very much concentrated in the less poor segment of the population. Okay, so why might that be? I mean, this is suggestive. So what these figures show now are some of those pathways. And what you really see is that the positive treatment effects on food consumption in the household are really concentrated at that poorest end of the distribution. This is consistent with what we might expect, based on theory, based on previous evidence, that it's those poorest households that were really closest to subsistence, absent the program, and the program comes in, and that's where you see the biggest boost in food consumption at the margin. And I think the argument would be that food consumption is converting quite directly to this stunting reduction in that segment of the population. Whereas when you look at the psychological distress measures, you see no treatment effect in that poorest segment of the population, but where the positive effects are less poor. So we're seeing this kind of poorest segment of the population really have a lot of benefit in terms of food consumption, but the caregiver stress in that segment is not necessarily improving in the same way, and we could speculate on why that might be. Just one more way to represent what's happening in terms of the stunting outcome. When what you're really seeing is that poorest segment of the population, their stunting coming down to essentially be consistent with the stunting levels in the less poor part of the population. So you can see in the control group, stunting is highest as you get to that poorest, kind of closest to subsistence households. But then in the treatment group, you introduce graduation, and those stunting rates are coming down to about 20-25% in the same range as the stunting rates in the less poor population. So let's look at heterogeneity by timing. So this figure on the right here, I think, is quite striking. There's a few different things happening. So on the x-axis of this figure is the child's date of birth, right? So Graduation delivery starts in early 2019. We have a bunch of children who are born before the program started, and then children who are born during the program and after the program. And what we really see is a few different things happening here. Children that are out of that first 1,000 days window when the program is introduced, almost no effect on stunting. And we see it's the same relationship, the same basic graph if you look at the executive function measures. So this is evidence of a cohort effect, basically that the children who are out of that critical period when the program is introduced don't really receive the same benefit. And then as exposure during that first 1,000 days increases, depending on when the child is born, you see a ramping up of the effect. And again, this is consistent with what the treatment effects on the executive function and IDELA skills also look like. So this just drives home the importance of kind of exposure in that really early critical period to get the full benefit for children. On the other side, on the right-hand side of the figure, you're seeing, I think, evidence of an age effect. I mean, this first few years of life is really when the stunting starts to sort of show up in children, and the accumulation of the positive effects on the program, kind of during that period, you're seeing a ramping up of treatment effects. If we visit these kids again in a few years, we would hope to see that those same children, that the treatment effects grow as they get older. Really think of it as a trajectory, and these children are on a better trajectory. And so, as the children who don't get the program, stunting increases in those early years. The children who get the program, they're on a better trajectory. The last thing I'll mention is heterogeneity by location. So this is a measure of location that is essentially orthogonal or uncorrelated with the wealth measure. We could get into that more during the discussion, but one of the important things you're seeing here is that the stunting effect is also concentrated in villages that have a low baseline stunting rate. And the self-regulation effect is also concentrated in those same villages. So this is evidence that there's something at the village level that's really supporting the conversion of these types of household level inputs into the child development outcomes. And I don't have time to dig into that too much more, but we could talk about it during the conversation if that's of interest. So just to summarize, we're really seeing kind of evidence of two primary biological pathways: increased food consumption, improved early childhood nutrition, converting to physical growth. We're seeing evidence of reduced stress amongst adult women and corresponding potential in utero and early childhood environment converting to neurodevelopment. That could be through a biological mechanism in utero, a cortisol, a relationship between cortisol and dysregulation in childhood. There's some very well established at this point sort of biological pathways through stress, through which stress influences neurodevelopment. And then there's also the behavioral pathway of caregiver-child interaction in those early years, and stress being an impediment to sort of the quality of those types of interactions. In the poorest households, we're seeing evidence of pathway 1, but not pathway 2. And in the less poor households, we're seeing evidence of pathway 2, and then also increased food consumption, but no effect on physical growth. But really, a much lower baseline stunting rate could be part of the explanation. And we're seeing in those sort of more advantaged villages, this conversion from 1 to 2, 1 and 2 to human capital seems to be quite influenced by that environment. The last thing I'll say is this combination of cohort and age effects we saw in that figure I showed before is a plausible explanation for why you might see short-term null effects and then medium-term positive effects. So we don't have many studies that follow these children, even in the cash transfer literature, out to 6, 7 years. And the short-term effects with that cohort and age effects we're seeing, the positive effects concentrated in young children, but we need to wait a little bit longer perhaps before they're observable. The results we see here are consistent with a study of a cash transfer program in Indonesia that found no effect after 2 years, quite large positive effects after 6 years. And in that study, they mention that they see some evidence of age effects. They don't measure older children, so they can't really examine cohort effects. I look forward to discussing after the rest of the presentations.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. Happy to hand it over to Moritz so you get set up. Oh, there we go.
Great. All right. Yeah. Thanks so much for having us. Thanks to IPA for the continued support. This is joint work with Yamba Malawi, and Maxwell is in the chat, so do reach out to him. And then I have two wonderful co-authors, Andrew Foster and Shansu Sa, who's going to be on the job market this year. Julie did a great job, I think, giving us the kind of broad motivation for this line of work. Intergenerational impacts on children are really the next frontier for these graduation programs. On the flip side, if we're not able to impact young children with an anti-poverty program like this, we might find ourselves doing this exact same line of work in a generation down the line again. Julie mentioned a number of reasons why we might so far have only very scant evidence of impacts on children. And so you can think of this study as really trying to stack all the cards in the favor of the graduation program to find impacts on young children and seeing if it can deliver that. So what you're going to see here today is a graduation program that has a streamlined ECD component baked throughout of its components. It's a study that's targeted directly at young mothers with young children to have taken care both of the intra-household allocation aspect and the statistical power aspects of this question. This is an RCT, a cluster RCT that takes place in southern Malawi, Mangochi district, extremely poor area of the country, and notably one of very high child deprivation. Children across both anthropometrics and early childhood development are about a standard deviation behind their peers in other reference studies. Study has about 1,900 households, as I said, targeted at mothers of an under 5 child below the extreme poverty line. And today I can show you the 12-month results. So this is much more short-term than what you just saw from Peter. 24-month follow-up is in progress. In terms of graduation programs, this is the kind of cash flavor version of a UPG. So you have households that receive 6 months of consumption support after being encouraged to join a savings group. They receive 6 months of entrepreneurship training, and at the end of that, a large one-off seed capital grant with which they can start their own business. This is roughly the order of magnitude of what, for example, Give Directly is handing out in terms of cash. For the duration of the first year, households receive one-on-one coaching visits at home to revise some of the topics that were discussed in group trainings. And now critically, here in purple is alongside the entrepreneurship training, likewise for the mother, an early childhood development training. And that's really the key new component in this UPG. The ECD training consists of 16 weekly sessions in a group setting of about 1.5 hours, in which facilitators talk through parenting advice, nutrition advice, health advice, and the rights of a child. The program draws on familiar indigenous stories and songs in order, as a vehicle, in order to transport some of the latest insights in parenting and ECD research to parents to transmit on to their children. The program was designed by Yamba Malawi, and it's been endorsed by the Malawi Ministry of Gender. Maybe important to note what this program is not. The program does not involve any direct child interaction or stimulation. The pathway really is through the mother, and no direct nutrition provision either. The theory of change here really is that if you help mothers with their livelihoods and at the same time teach them the best kind of ways to interact with their children, that's going to have the biggest impacts on kids. In the coaching one-on-one home visits, many of these topics are being reiterated, and there is, I should note, a community level intervention here as well, where childcare centers are being supported with a similar condensed training and in-kind support. But this component is also extended to the control group clusters. So this is not part of the intervention we're testing here. Similar outcomes to what we saw earlier: anthropometrics, height, weight, mid-upper arm circumference, all age standardized. And then we are measuring 3 types of early childhood development scales. CREDI for the youngest children, this is caregiver reported. MDAT for children 0 to 6, this is directly child assessed. We don't have those results yet. And then for slightly older children, 2 to 9, the IDELA scale. Starting on results, these are the anthropometrics. I first want to draw your attention to column 1 here. This is the control group levels, and you can see this quite severe stunting. Malawi is the most stunted country on earth. Children are about 1.5 standard deviations behind their peers in terms of height, almost a standard deviation behind on weight. At the 12-month mark, which is where this evaluation took place, we don't see any impacts on anthropometrics. These are relatively tight knots. We're going to be coming back after another year and hopefully further into the future to see if maybe some of these effects just take some time to develop. However, where we do see, I think, some exciting impacts is on the cognitive and non-cognitive results for children. The CREDI scale has international benchmark data, and so we can again benchmark where the control group is at compared to children in other parts of the world. And we again see this full standard deviation behind. This is equivalent to 3 to 6 months of being behind in your development. And there, for the youngest children, so CREDI, we see about 0.25 standard deviations of an increase. Note that this is caregiver reported. This may, at least in part, be driven by experiment or demand effects, which is why we're adding the MDAT scale that we'll have results on relatively soon. For the older children, we still see effects on the order of 0.1 of a standard deviation, very similar to what Peter just showed you in the other study. Situating this within the literature, you can see in dark blue here meta-analyses of parenting interventions where parents receive one-on-one household visits, where they are encouraged to interact with their children more, do child stimulation. And then in dark green are our impacts on the youngest children, so 0 to 3, that fall relatively closely within what the literature has reported. And similarly, from a meta-study for slightly older children who receive pre-primary education in gray, and then in light green, our effect sizes next to that. So this graduation program, which remember has a ton of other outcomes just in the poverty space, is in this case able to kind of replicate some of the state-of-the-art parenting and ECD interventions with an ECD component baked in. There's a whole host of potential channels, other variables that are kind of moving along the side. This study is not designed to tease apart and tell you exactly which of these channels matters most, but I think it's important to still kind of highlight there are dramatic increases in the material investment that parents do in their children. About a quarter of the unconditional cash transfers that they receive, parents invest in their children. The quality of parental interaction with their children goes up quite dramatically, as observed by our staff members, even though the raw time that parents spend with their children goes down very slightly by about an hour per week. Children are much more likely to be enrolled in preschool childcare centers, and parents report that they feel much more confident later in life to be able to afford children going through school. And so through dynamic complementarities, this might be triggering already early on an investment in their children. Dramatic increases in mothers' mental health. At the bottom here, I've put female empowerment and ECD knowledge. We have statistically significant, but fairly modest increases in both of those. And so personally, I'd be surprised if these factors by themselves were driving the results that we're seeing here. It must be a broader picture than that. I'll show you 2 dimensions of heterogeneity. First is on the gender of the child. We see very sizable effects for girls. The sample now is cut into 2, and so we lack a bit of precision. If you take the point estimates for boys at face value, those are still not small effects. Those are still important improvements for boys, slightly imprecise, but really they are quite a bit larger for girls. And then an important determinant of whether children benefit from this program appears to be whether mothers are able to read and write. So we have, again, the younger and the older children. The effect sizes are similar among the youngest children, where stimulation involves things like educative play. But then for the older kids, where we're getting to emergent numeracy and literacy, the effect sizes are statistically quite significantly different between mothers who know how to read and write and mothers who do not. And in kind of adjacent analysis, we show that these mothers who can read and write also learn a lot more and retain a lot more from the program in other dimensions. Quick note on costs. Graduation programs aren't cheap. Yamba's program comes out kind of comfortably at the upper end of the range of where most graduation programs are, $1,600 per household. I would note, however, that the biggest cost driver here is Malawi's highly unusual currency exchange policy. About 50% of the cost is just due to currency exchange, and that would make it actually very kind of normal pricing. And this includes already the cash transfers. If you believe an earlier study that came up briefly by Bouga and Dillon, that the ECD gains here are entirely tied to the ECD component and wouldn't happen without that component, then your cost of about $250 within those $1,600 for the ECD component are a pretty good bargain. This is cheaper than most of the meta-study comparisons that I showed you earlier for comparable effect sizes. On the other hand, we just saw Peter present a study where after a much longer lag, you find somewhat similar results when there was no ECD component. And I think that's going to be one of the key areas where future work is needed. To wrap up, we show that a child-focused graduation program can generate meaningful improvements for the kids, specifically on cognitive development. These are very early on effects. They don't take as long to materialize as other studies. We'll see if they persist. It is possible that we might have had these results even without an ECD component. That's not something we can say just based on this study, and Peter's work is kind of tantalizing there. But what we do see here are really immediate effects that make us hopeful that these are going to grow over time. Maybe one more broader lesson from the literature is that this is another case where a graduation program is a really capable vehicle for an add-on intervention. So we have other studies that focus a lot on father's involvement or female empowerment, couple therapy alongside a graduation program. When you're anyways in the household, very cost effectively, you can push these other objectives. Great. That's where I'm going to leave it. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Moritz. Happy to hand it over to Sarah and to add an additional context, time frame, and structure to this research. Oh, sorry, Sarah, you're on mute.
Okay, great. How's that?
There you go. Okay.
All right, perfect. Thank you. I was just saying, we wish we could jump in immediately to discussion, but we have one more study to add to the webinar today. And so this is a collaboration with BRAC, where IPA served as the learning partner for this overall project, where BRAC was interested in implementing a two-generation approach. So similar to Moritz's presentation, thinking about targeting outcomes both for what graduation programs are able to achieve around economics and household outcomes, but then also thinking about early childhood development. But the approach with this project was to combine two of BRAC's flagship programs. So we've been discussing the Targeting the Ultra-Poor graduation program, which has been pioneered by BRAC, but BRAC also has an early childhood development, early child care and education intervention called the Play Lab, and in some settings, the Humanitarian Play Lab. And so the goals for this project was to implement both of these programs at the same time. And so this is really exciting. This represents the first time that BRAC was doing this. So with the same population, implementing both the Targeting the Ultra-Poor graduation program and the Humanitarian Play Lab. So it's important to recognize that both of these interventions themselves are multi-component. So in this context, in Uganda, the Play Lab is like a preschool intervention, a pre-primary education intervention. So it's for children ages 3 to 5 for about 4 hours a day during the 5 days of the week. Children attend to the center, and play leaders are recruited from the community to promote early childhood development. And because this is taking place in a humanitarian setting, there's also content on mental health and psychosocial support. But there's parenting engagement and community engagement. And so this is the sort of full intervention of the Play Lab. And then, as Julie presented, the UPG program is also a multi-component intervention, trying to address the sort of holistic needs of ultra-poor households. And so this project really represents just one way that these two programs could be combined. So here you can see something of a spectrum between how could a graduation program and a Play Lab or a preschool, pre-primary education program could be combined. So on the left-hand side, you could think about a standard graduation program. So this might be similar to the sort of intervention that Moritz was presenting, where you have the graduation program and then you use that home visiting model or add in these group sessions to focus on promoting responsive caregiving, early childhood development, many of the topics to think about how you can implement the graduation program, but also include attention to early childhood development. On the other end of the spectrum, you can consider the preschool program, the Play Lab, the pre-primary education intervention, and thinking about adding in some social protection or other engagement with parents to support their livelihoods or mental health or things like that. But then the project that I'm presenting about today represents this middle where both interventions are being implemented in their entirety. So the entire graduation program is being implemented alongside the Play Lab. I'll discuss a little bit more of this today, but this was also part of the broader project, collaborating with BRAC to explore how these two interventions could be interrelated and reinforced. So not just two separate interventions that happen to be implemented at the same time with the same population, but really drawing on these linkages. And again, this theory behind two-generation programs, could this lead to more transformative impact, to really breakthrough impact, particularly for households facing severe adversity, which is another important part of this project, is that it's focused on refugee and host communities in Uganda's West Nile region. So this is a map from UNHCR showing that most people are coming in from South Sudan over the border into Uganda. And then we're zooming in on two refugee settlements, so the Mvepi and refugee settlements in the West Nile region and neighboring host communities. And that maps onto our study. So each dot here represents a household in the study, and you can see they're clustered by color representing the villages. So this is a relatively small study. We only had 27 villages, and that's because we had to integrate this research project into the broader plans for implementation. And so sometimes that has some various challenges for the research associated with that. So I'll mention that in a little bit. But about 80% of our sample is from the refugee community, and just under 20% of the sample is from the host community. So I'm going to emphasize the research design because it's important to think about what we can and cannot answer with this study, or think about which questions most align with design. So all households in the study were located in a village where BRAC would implement a Play Lab. This is because of the larger, implementation targets that BRAC had for the project. So working across these communities to provide these early education services. And this is really important because Uganda currently does not have any public provision of preschool. So the government's provision of education begins in first grade. And so having a humanitarian Play Lab really is meeting a need for early education services. All households in the study qualified for the graduation program, so BRAC conducted a census to identify the most vulnerable households. So this is really important to recognize that, not only are we working in refugee and host communities, but we're also only working in the ultra-poor households within those communities, so the most vulnerable. This is not representative. This population is not representative of the broader community. And then within that, each household had to have a child in the appropriate age range to attend the Play Lab. And so the treatment, the aspect that we're studying, so the random assignment, was of the graduation program. So we're really assessing the impact of the graduation program for households with a child attending the Play Lab. And so our motivating questions is first, as we've seen, there's this incredible body of research on the ultra-poor graduation program, but not as much in humanitarian settings. And so it's always important to see, our first order question is the ultra-poor graduation program improving the outcomes that we often see for adult caregivers in the household? And then if we do we also see an impact on outcomes for children? Because again, we don't have as much of an evidence base there. And sometimes we see some different studies showing that, sort of outcomes at the household level or for caregivers don't always translate into outcomes for children. If we do see that, what are the mechanisms? How might we understand what might connect the UPG program to children's experiences? And that'll help us think about, there are many different ways these two interventions could be combined, or many different ways to think about integrating efforts to alleviate poverty, support caregivers and households with how to promote child's development. So one important thing to note is, again, we had a relatively small sample, so we did have some baseline imbalance. We had more refugees in the control group than the treatment group. So we try to control for this, but it's really important to still recognize. And it also had some implications for the end line. So it's interesting that this was actually something that we see as potential impact of the program, in that households who received the graduation program were more likely to stay in Uganda and not return to South Sudan. And so that meant we were actually able to find more households, sort of 2 years after the start of the program, in the control group. So again, we're trying to control for this, but sort of a really important factor to keep in mind, and one of the limitations of the study. But before we even get to the impact, or get to the final impact and the end line, we also conducted a time use study within this broader project. So one of the main reasons for this was, a key question is if graduation programs might actually take away time for childcare, right? So there are many reasons why we might think combining early childhood content and graduation could be really positive, but there could also be unintended consequences or other threats here. So if focusing on income generating activities, livelihoods, maybe caregivers might not be able to provide as much support for children during this period. That was one thing we really wanted to look into. So we conducted a sub-study 1 year into the program to really focus on this. And we had a very intensive observation protocol where we had 2 enumerators in the household, one watching the child and one watching the primary caregiver, typically the mother, to really see what kind of changes we might see between households receiving the graduation program and those that were not. So from the perspective of the caregiver, we really didn't see many differences. We saw really only statistically significant difference we saw was in relation to taking care of livestock, but this represented a very small percent of caregivers' time overall. And maybe one factor is this was a year into the study, and so this wasn't the most intensive part of the graduation program, which is usually the beginning and the startup. But still, this was very encouraging that we didn't see this dramatic shift. From the child's perspective, we also didn't really see many significant differences. So we had a small sample, but you can see these trends from child doing chores, the time spent a child that has alone, and the time that a child spends in the care of another child. You can see the treatment on the right, receiving the graduation program, compared to households that did not receive the graduation program on the left. And we really don't see very many differences. So this is very encouraging. But then also, we actually do see a potential positive difference in that the participation in the graduation program, again, because this isn't a typical graduation program, this is being implemented alongside the play lab, and the two are intentionally being aligned and interacting. And so graduation staff receive training on early child development and are really supporting this engagement with caregivers and young children. And we potentially see direct interaction increasing, which is really important because overall, we see very little direct interaction. Right. So during the morning, children were attending the play lab. And so we watched children for 4 hours in the afternoon, and only 5% of that time was spent in direct interaction with caregivers. The majority of children's time is either loose supervision or no supervision, right? And so it's really important to recognize in almost half of households, no direct interaction was observed in the entire period, including care from older siblings. So by the time children reach this preschool age range, it seems they're very independent. They're walking to the play lab by themselves. They're off spending time in their environment. And so this was really interesting to see that from this time use perspective, we see very limited interaction between caregivers and children, noting that this is still just a percent of the day, but really important takeaway in sort of the time use study. So now really quickly to get to the end line and our broader results. Again, one of our first questions is the graduation program improving some of the key outcomes for adult caregivers in the household that we typically see? And we generally see a lot of exciting findings here, right? So across the 2 previous studies and the broader literature on graduation, we see improvement in household food security, financial strain, and a number of different outcomes for adult caregivers. Graduation impact on food security was particularly exciting because this was a very challenging time period in which rations for refugee communities, for example, were being cut in the West Nile region. And we see generally that the improvements in food security were experienced by the average household. So less of an impact for the extreme food insecure households and also the more secure households, but really exciting that we see this positive impact on food security. But also important to note, we didn't see impacts on everything that we might have expected. So for example, no impact on psychological distress, no impact on expectations or aspirations for child education, but also no impact on caregivers' time use, echoing what we saw in the time use study, which is very encouraging, right? Noting that even very comprehensive livelihoods programs do not have to take away time or undermine time for childcare is a really important finding of the study. So then our primary outcome measure for children is the IDELA, again, this sort of broad holistic school readiness assessment. And here we have on the left the composite score and then the different domains. Really exciting to see this very large positive effect. Because remember, this study is not assessing the impact of the play lab. All children in the study are attending the play lab. We're seeing the impact of getting the graduation program on top of having a child enrolled in the play lab. We see this very consistent across many of the different domains. But like with the other studies, it was really important to investigate heterogeneity and impact by subgroups. And one of the things that was really striking was it seems that the entire effect of the program on the IDELA is really being driven by the refugee households. And we don't see a statistically significant effect for the host community. So what we see actually is that we have a really large effect. So 0.4 standard deviation improvement on the IDELA composite score for refugee households and no statistically significant effect. So you can see a sort of negative point estimate there, but no statistically significant effect for the host community. And so this is a really important theme that we've been talking with Brack about and trying to understand what might be driving this. And it's also important to look across the different domains. So for example, for literacy, we really again see this dramatic dynamic here, and that might relate to their different languages spoken across the refugee and host communities. But also at baseline, we see more early childhood engagement in services for the refugee community. So maybe before this intervention, a lot of interventions were targeting refugee communities, so they had a different starting point than the host community. But it's also interesting, we don't see this across every domain, right? So for example, here for numeracy, we really don't see this difference. So definitely something to follow up on. So very quickly, because we want to leave a little bit of time for discussion, but like the other studies, trying to understand, well, what are the mechanisms that might explain this? How do we understand how the impact of the graduation program and the experience of caregivers and households might be translating into young children's experience? One important thing to note is we see no impact on the indicators that we have for children's health. So the middle upper arm circumference indicator of malnutrition, no impact on the incidence of diarrhea. This is important both because these are really important outcomes in and of themselves, but we also hypothesize that this would be a really important pathway for children's improvement and experience in the play lab. If children are less hungry, less distracted, healthier, maybe they're engaging more in the play lab, attending more consistently and frequently, and better able to pay attention, but we really don't see any evidence of that pathway. Similarly, we also don't see any impact on parents' engagement with children. So this maybe speaks to the findings of the time use study that caregivers aren't spending that much time with children overall. But even though the play lab is trying to promote caregivers' engagement and play with young children, we really don't see that as a pathway. And instead, what we see is caregivers' engagement in the play lab. So they seem more likely to ever attend the parenting sessions that are part of the play lab and a number of sessions. So they have, on average, attended more sessions of the parenting program associated with the play lab. And so this is really interesting because in conversations with the BRAC implementation team, one of the things they brought up was that many caregivers thought they were receiving the graduation program because of their engagement with the play lab. So even though there was no conditionality between the two interventions, many households thought that because they were being implemented alongside each other around the same time, and there were these reinforcing elements between them. So that ends up being what looks like one of the critical pathways explaining our impacts on the IDELA is this play lab attendance, this engagement that parents have. But the second other pathway that we looked at in our causal mediation analysis that was, very exploratory, but looking at what might explain this impact and the idea that the graduation program might be improving children's outcomes because of its interaction with the play lab is one of our key conclusions. Also that, noting the findings from the time use study, that implementation of the graduation program does not have to undermine time and care for children is critically important. But again, emphasizing this wasn't an average graduation program. There was this attention and framing and focus on early childhood development that might have really influenced its implementation. So I'm going to quickly skip through these conclusions and outstanding questions so we can get to the discussion section. So I'm going to hand it over to Julie, and maybe if people are able to stay for a couple minutes, we'll be able to talk and ask a few questions coming up today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, everybody. And we really appreciate you packing in so much rich research and evidence into this short hour. And I've been following along in the chat and some interesting discussion. One of the questions that we received, and if you have a few minutes just to sort of make a reflection, was on what design would you recommend to improve both sort of livelihoods and impacts on young children. I think all of this research indicates that we don't yet know the answer there, but I'd be curious to maybe have a very quick reflection from each of our researchers on where you think the most important investment in sort of this evidence gap might be moving forward, either for your own research or for the space more broadly. I think we're discovering some really fascinating and really critical parts of this puzzle, but if you could invest in one other question or measure moving forward, what might that be? Happy to start with Peter. Give Sarah a break because she.
Well, maybe just thinking about kind of the study that I presented and what the next questions are. I mean, I think we need another follow-up with these kids to dig a little bit more into what might be happening with the executive function skills and stress. I mean, hearing Moritz and Sarah's presentation, I think there's some questions around kind of time use and quality of caregiver-child interaction and what that means in the context of a program that's trying to encourage women to sort of shift labor and in settings where there might not be good access to early childhood sort of care services. But in terms of the role of the biological pathway as well. And so I think going back and trying to disentangle a little bit about caregiver-child interaction versus more of the biological stress pathways and cortisol. I think there's a lot of sort of important questions there that need to be answered. I think I'd also like to follow up with the kids in my study to really observe at another wave those cohort and age effects we need another wave to really try to separate those two things and really understand sort of what the program is going to do for children in the long term. I mean, I think part of the argument for why graduation could be really cost effective or have a high cost benefit for children is the persistent consumption effects could translate to improved child outcomes over multiple children with a one-time intervention, which would really make the cost benefit sort of argument very attractive. But that's the premise, that's based on the idea that the economic benefits persist and the benefits to children accrue kind of over the long term. And we need better evidence to really understand that, to make a clear argument around what the cost benefit analysis kind of graduation looks like for children.
Thanks so much, Peter. Moritz, any reflections or Hansu?
Yeah, I think I'll let Jansu start on the programming and then I'll say something on targeting.
In today's presentation, we saw a lot of positive impact on early childhood development. And since these children are starting to go to school or more preschool, we would also be interested on looking on the medium or long run outcomes on their education, what happens when they go to school. So I think the next avenue would be to look at the longer terms of how we can translate these school readiness into real school outcomes. And then I'll pass on to Moritz.
So I think today we certainly haven't given you an answer to the question, what is the thing you really need to impact children? We don't know that. We found some impacts of the various versions of graduation programs on children. That means, though, we have impacts on kids. And so if, as a funder, as an implementer, you have a particular focus on kids, then use that maybe for targeting. If a lot of the settings that we work in, I think the Mangochi setting, about 40% of the households had a child in that most malleable age range. That is going to be then maybe your target audience. You can move these young kids' lives. The exact mix of intervention, TBD, but targeting is going to be critical.
And over to you, Sarah, to take us home.
Yeah, and maybe very quickly on that point too, I think recognizing that it seems like children of different ages, you have different windows of opportunity and what skills and things to target, and this balance between what might be overburdening a household and trying to pack too much into a graduation program versus connecting to other existing services and promoting those services too. So I think Moritz's findings about the investment in and potential investment in attending the community-based centers and anticipating later education phases, thinking about that complementarity, I think is a really exciting direction moving forward.
Great. And with that, I think that we'll close for today. I want to thank our researchers so much for taking the time and for presenting this really rich research. Also, our implementing partners for having implemented such high quality programming that's been really impactful in the lives of graduation households and their children. Looking forward to further investment, discussion, and research along these topics. So thank you so much. Take care.